Well, hello, everybody. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to skip over the beatboxing that I had planned to start us off with. I know. But it's really a pleasure to be here with this incredible panel. So it's an honor to introduce them. So we're going to start off with Dr. Meghan Groome, who is the Senior Vice President of Education at the New York Academy of Sciences, where she heads a number of different programs and interventions across the city. She's also an adjunct professor at the State University of New York and the founder of a consultants agency that focuses on ed reform issues at the state, national, and international level. Dr. Allison Scott is the Chief Research Officer at the Kapor Center for Social Impact, focusing on interventions that address diversity issues across the tech pipeline. Before joining the Kapor Center, Dr. Scott was the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Level Playing Field Institute here in the Bay Area, and Program Lead for NIH's Enhancing Workforce Diversity Program. And finally, Dr. Jane Margolis is a senior researcher at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Science. For the last 15 years, she's studied the low numbers of young women and students of color in computer science and has authored award-winning books like Unlocking the Clubhouse and Stuck in the Shallow End. She's also one of the authors of the Exploring Computer Science curriculum, which has had tremendous success bringing computer science to underrepresented youth across the country. So welcome to all three of these panelists. So we're going to talk about understanding impact and maximizing the efficacy of funding. And I'm going to start with a question for the whole panel, and maybe we can all weigh in on this. So for each of you in your own work, how do you guys measure success? What does success look like for each of you?
I can start. We have sort of two big pockets of people that we're trying to make more successful. So one of them is graduate students, postdocs, kids who are already in the STEM pipeline, and we're trying to keep them there, make them more employable by giving them better teaching, mentoring, and communication skills. So that upper level, just before the workforce, and then starting at pre-K all the way through high school, getting kids excited and engaged in a developmentally appropriate way. And I think for the younger students, we're just looking to give them a really positive experience in STEM. And so when they come back and they say something like, oh my gosh, I love engineering, I want to be an engineer, or I love my engineer, that's really great for us. And at the upper high school levels, just keeping them engaged in their coursework and just keeping them on track. And then for the graduate students, it's all about finding them a job. So we're pretty tactical about that, but then also making sure our partnerships, we partner with the Department of Youth and Community Development, who's here from New York City, and making sure that our partnerships are successful and that they're what we would call mutually beneficial all around.
So for our K-12 programs, actually, we run the Summer Math and Science Honors Academy. And so I think we're looking at two similar and related outcomes. So one is short-term outcomes. So we are taking students who have had zero exposure to computer science and who also 9 times out of 10 don't have access to computer science courses in their schools, and providing a rigorous sequence of 3 summers of courses. So we're looking at short-term outcomes like attitudes or interests, or like, do they perceive of computer science as something that they might want to pursue in college and career. And then we're really looking at the long-term outcomes of what is the impact of having 3 summers of courses. Does that lead to success in taking AP CS exams? Does that lead to matriculating into higher education? And ultimately, what we would love to see is an increase in the number of underrepresented students who are getting CS degrees. So I think we like to look at growth, and again, starting from a place of like no access and no interest, all the way through to success.
Okay, so our work is, I would say that it's really about systemic change, and so that raises a whole other issue about how you evaluate the impact of systemic change. So we look at our work in computer science, which is trying to get more African American, Latinos, and girls involved in computer science, is really within a larger question about segregation and how fields become segregated. And so we look at sort of 3 main areas, what we call structural areas in the schools. Our work is focused on K-12 education and why there are so few African Americans, Latinos, and females learning computer science. We look at the structural issues, which are the lack of classes and teachers. Like, teachers are key, so are there teachers that can teach this subject? Counselors, all the issues that have to do with structural inequities inside of the schools. And then we look at belief systems, which are also another really important part of how segregation is maintained, and how belief systems about who can and who cannot do computer science, who will excel and who will not, how those belief systems seep in and drive a lot of the inequity within the school systems. And then we look at policy, larger educational policy. So our strategy is very much about systemic change. And then, as I said, that raises a lot of questions about how do you come up with impact and measurement of systemic change and breaking segregation.
Well, and so, given the complexity of, for example, measuring systemic change, right? For the grant makers out there, some of whom may be in this room, potential grant makers who may be in the building somewhere. Meghan, I'm curious, for you, what would you say to a grant maker about how they should evaluate ROI, right? Because a lot of them are thinking that's the bottom line. So what advice would you have for a grant maker in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on who the grant maker is and what their style and approach is. Because with individuals who want to give money, it's very much about their individual passions and what they want to see and about their own narrative. So often when you ask someone that question that you just asked us, what does success look like? They talk about a personal experience to themselves and wanting to give that experience to more people. So their return on investment is about, I have changed these number of people's lives in a way that my life was changed. For a foundation, you have foundations that have very sophisticated and complex ways of thinking about ROI, and they may not be a good match for a small community-based nonprofit that's trying to make change just literally in their neighborhood block. And then you may have corporate social responsibility dollars where they're just looking to say, we impacted 1,000 kids and our ROI is really just based on a really crude number of kids or hours or something like that. So my advice to funders, and having been someone who's done funding myself, is really, what are you trying to get out of it? And then making sure that's right sized to the type of organizations you want to work for. It's really hard to go and work with a community organization and ask them to, make data-driven decisions. But it's really important to ask them a question that sounds something like, how can you use these very basic evaluation metrics to make sure that you're not only doing what you think that you're doing, but also getting better at doing it and helping people have more internal checks that give them positive feedback so that they're moving in that way. But there can be a real mismatch between even the idea of ROI and, let's say, a youth development organization or an organization. The Academy just started to do education again in 2010 and wasn't necessarily particularly sophisticated at data collection and that type of stuff. And it was only after getting National Science Foundation money that we were able to have a much more sophisticated data set to even talk from. So I think that right sizing is important.
Well, so on that note, Allison, sort of a similar question. Rather than for the grant maker, what about the grantee? What advice would you give a young, a young startup here or a young nonprofit about how they should be thinking about measuring their own impact, knowing what the grant makers are looking for? Sure.
So I can talk a little bit from my own experience. When I started at the Level Playing Field Institute in 2011, the Honors Academy had been running for about 7 years and hadn't collected a lot of data. So one of the things that we found it was a huge barrier for us in going to funders is that we could not talk concretely about what impact we were having. And so I think going to Meghan's point, we were talking a lot of anecdotes about things we saw or students that we saw their lives transformed. So we implemented this very rigorous evaluation plan that's longitudinal. And I think that has actually really shifted the ways that we are perceived in the grant-making community. My advice would be a couple things. One is to start off with just a basic logic model, understanding what barrier are you trying to address. So what is the number one thing you're trying to address? If it's access, what is the intervention that you're doing to address access? And then what is the outcome that's aligned? So a lot of times people aren't interested in developing logic models, but I think it's a very helpful exercise to help you understand what data to collect at the end. And then I think the other point that I was making earlier about the difference between short-term and long-term outcomes, to really try to articulate and identify what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve beyond just counting numbers. So that's something that we also see quite frequently in that, like, what is the true impact that you're trying to achieve? And again, it goes back to identifying what the barrier is and what the intervention is. But instead of just saying, we have 30 kids or 5,000 kids in our program, like, what's the impact you're having on those kids? And it should have a logical progression.
Sure. Well, and Jane, on a similar note, for organizations that you've seen or that you've been a part of, what are the challenges for them as they develop in coming up with these definitions of success? Right, they're trying to balance the numbers versus the narratives and the stories. Like, what? I don't know if you could share some of those.
Yeah, especially now that we're at CS for All, and everyone, there's just these big initiatives to scale. I think that we have become, and our numbers have grown. If we look at the numbers of kids involved in the classes, and if we look at the number of teachers and the number of schools. But our real question is what is happening inside the classroom with the learning that's going on, and what is the depth of the learning that's happening. And just an example, when we first started out in 2004, after we had collected all the research for Stuck in the Shallow End, and we saw there were all these disparities in access according to race and socioeconomics. What we did was we saw that AP Computer Science was in just very, very few schools. Mm-hmm. And what was in the schools with the high numbers of African American and Latino kids was classes that were called computer science, but were really like keyboarding and internet searching. So what we came up with a strategy, and in our partnership with the district, was that we were going to increase AP Computer Science in more schools throughout the district. This was in 2004. And we did that. Wow. I mean, the numbers, if you see the charts, if I had a PowerPoint, the numbers of schools that took on AP Computer Science and the number of kids and the number of teachers just escalated. And because we're in a district that's mostly Latino, 75% Latino, and the district is Los Angeles, 75% Latino, 8% African American. Our numbers of underrepresented students were extremely high. And but when we started looking at not only test scores, but we looked at the experience of students in that course, we were shaken to the core. And we felt that what we learned from this is we increased our numbers, and everyone was touting us as a success within the district, and the district was using our numbers to, show that they've spread AP Computer Science. But actually, our big lesson from that was that kids that don't have the privilege to go to computer summer camp, and they don't have the resources at home, they were not getting the proper preparation and scaffolding to go right into AP Computer Science. So that what is really necessary is that we know what is the student learning that is going inside in our programs, and also what is the quality of the teaching that is happening. And where that gets really complicated is that teachers grow. Mm-hmm. And so if you take a snapshot of a teacher in year one, it could be somewhat variable, problematic, whereas if you would look at it over time. And so one of the things is that often grants don't give you a longitudinal time to work out your program, and you just get a short snippet. But educational change doesn't happen in short snippets. So how do you evaluate impact with taking into account the need for growth? And then there's all these different issues that we can talk about. How do you even evaluate student learning? How do you evaluate student learning?
Yeah, it seems like as you start a program, and I think every time I've started or seen a new program start, you're like, we're going to do something, it's going to be awesome, and you start to get this data back, and it's like, it's so awesome. It's like a wave of amazing things. Look at how many kids are in these programs. And then you get a little more sophisticated about your data, and it's like those Chinese nesting dolls, and you open it up, and there's another one in there, and you're like, oh my God, we're doing a terrible job. I just looked at these numbers, and no one's actually paying attention, and the kids are playing soccer, and all of these different things. So you tweak your intervention, and then you look at your data again, and you've gotten better, but you've also, so much more, that there's so much more work to do. And I think being with funders, being realistic and encouraging of that cycle of learning and understanding how to get better about what you do is the type of things that I see sophisticated, especially sophisticated foundations, but also some individuals being really good at and supporting of that cycle. And then sometimes they make you do things like learn about the science of getting better about things, and that's kind of swings a little too far for me. But I think the more sophisticated you get, the more you realize you have a lot more work to do.
So this brings up an interesting issue, about sort of red herrings, right? That, there's this one doll that you thought, this is the doll I'm going to optimize for. This is the impact I'm going to maximize. But it turns out there was a different doll hiding inside that you should have been looking at, or a doll over there. So I'll just put that to the whole panel. From the perspective of a program looking to maximize its impact, what are some common red herrings you've seen, things that people optimize for early on, only to realize 3 years later we should have been looking at something else?
I mean, I'll just say go back to the very crude, how many kids have been impacted by this program. And if you want to see I have examples of, okay, so there's 20,000 kids who are in this program, but actually only 300 of them received the intensive, very, very good intervention, and the rest of them got tickets to Mets games, but they were impacted by the program. So you have this sort of Program A, which is what you're actually asking for funding to do, and then an artificial inflation of the number of kids who have been impacted, and they've literally spent 2 hours in your space doing something that isn't particularly meaningful, and you're talking about engaging and exciting them. And that dilutes the fact that engagement and excitement is an important part of what we do, but I think that's one of the things that I've seen as a funder-led or a funder-released red herring.
I'll just build upon that because I would agree. Again, going back to the number counting and building upon that, the sophistication of understanding what issue you're trying to address. So if we can use the same examples about getting students into courses and even getting them inspired. So I think we would all think of that broadly as a success, right? So their attitudes have increased, their aspirations have increased, and their maybe identity or identification with computer science has increased. But if their skills haven't increased, then what has been the ultimate effect of the intervention? And I think that's where a lot of us are now having that conversation. So I would just maybe add to continue to get more sophisticated and think about what the ultimate outcome goal is, rather than just either the preliminary, how many can we touch, or even if you do have, like, we could report and have like a journal article out about significant findings on increasing attitudes and aspirations, which we've done, but now our next step is like, okay, but of all those students, only 10% have passed the AP exam. So have we achieved success just because we found some significant findings in attitudes and aspirations?
Yeah, I think this panel, this discussion about how we evaluate student learning is well, that's not what the topic is, but that's where we're kind of settling in, is on student learning a lot. I think it's the thing that we are wrestling with the most. We've engaged with a partnership with SRI to actually come up with measures that sort of capture the spirit of our curriculum and that can be given to students to figure out their learning. But there's this whole other area, which is, and we have some results to show this, about how the field becomes demystified to students, and the importance of that they've gone through a computer science class and they now somewhat have an inkling about what it is, and maybe it won't show in a test that much, but they can talk to their friends about it and it's not so mysterious. And what happens in 3 years' time if in a community college they have the nerve to now take a computer science class because they did it in high school, and how do you capture that? All these different levels, and there's just a very compelling story that was in the research that on another project that I was on that was related to computer science, and we have films of this female student who was trying to work with data and computing, and she ended up failing this course her first year. It was a course comparable to Algebra 2, but it was involving computer science, and she failed. And the second year, she got her nerve, she took it again, and she was almost like the star student. Like, her confidence was built up, and the way she became a leader in the class. And all of us just sat there like this. So, it made us feel like, okay, if we assessed our success with a student in that year one, what would it show? But then look in year two. And so we've just been reaching out to every expert organization that we can on student learning to try to come up with these measures. And it's really a tough nut to crack.
I mean, so I have other questions I had written down.
And Red Herring, by the way,
Yeah.
Red Herring, because I knew you told us you were going to ask about Red Herrings.
Yeah.
So I looked up Red Herring in the dictionary. So, because I couldn't quite get what a red herring would be in computer science. So red herring is an issue that sometimes gets thrown out to be a distraction, right, from the main issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the way you're using red herring, I would say that the numbers thing, sometimes it is a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, I had other questions.
It's important, though.
Of course.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
so I had other questions I had written down, but I feel like this is like the umpteenth panel or informal discussion that we've had where I think people on the implementing side, the program providers, we think about impact more as being different from scale.
Right.
And that scale is so often the ultimate red herring. And I'm wondering, for the three of you, how this seems like a fundamental misalignment between the way that a lot of grant makers are sort of habituated to thinking and the way a lot of the grant recipients are habituated to thinking. How do we bridge that gap? How do we tease apart scale from impact? Because they're not the same. So how do you explain that?
I mean, I think that scale, this idea of scale, it's like the holy grail. It's an obsession with certain funders. You have to get to scale, you have to get to scale. And when I think about program design, I think about, should this be a boutique? Should this be something that works in this neighborhood with these people at this time, that builds leadership and capacity within the people, so that when that teacher inevitably leaves, or that not-for-profit loses its funding, that the capacity has been built in those people and they can go and do other things. But that at that point in time, that's a boutique thing that's going to do really well. And something that's designed for scale, like McDonald's is designed for scale to be exactly the same thing in every context. That doesn't, there's many different ways to design for scale, but I think when people come in and they say, like, how many cities are you going to be in? And I'm like, well, I can come up with a pretty BS answer and tell you how many cities I'm in. Like I've been to 50 cities this year. I'm in 50 cities, right? Or I have kids. I have a kid who's downloaded a form in 50 cities. And for some people, they're just like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you're at scale. And then other places are like, no, tell me what design features you have. Tell me what your methodology is to design this thing for scale, and then what is a plan that you're gonna roll it out and do that. And I think trying to figure out how to help people if they even want to design for scale, and that there's a balance between impact, like you're changing the life of somebody, and just like, hey, they downloaded a form and therefore they now are inspired to become a medical doctor, and having a real conversation about what that is. You look at the CSI effect. So when I was teaching in the 2000s, I think we call it the 2000s, every one of my best students wanted to be a forensic scientist, with no understanding that that's actually like kind of a boring job. So that's a pretty big impact from an hour-long TV show that maybe we shouldn't discount, but is an example of this weird impact scale thing that can be aligned at some time.
I just wanted to reflect a little bit about on this comment. So I think maybe trying to think about what the commonalities are. So there might be a lack of understanding of true impact on the side of funders who are looking for scale. On the other side, I think most programs want to serve more students. And so I think trying to figure out, there is this disconnect, but trying to figure out, we need to speak the same language, right? So like with Jane's example, Jane wants to get more kids access to courses in a school district, because it's not sufficient to say, oh, we're going to have really deep impact on 30 kids in one classroom. So, but on the other hand, if you just provide very, basic interventions, then there's the impact trade-off. So that's kind of what I'm reflecting on.
Right, and that's the tension, But also, so I have been reading lately a lot of this network improvement community stuff, improvement science that you rolled your eyes at, and I
did not roll my eyes. I made a smile.
Oh, okay.
I did know.
Oh, okay. But I'm getting really interested in it and inspired by it. And one of the things that it talks about is this whole thing about scaling. And the thing that really settled in me is it said that so many educational reforms that have been pushed to scale, for all the reasons that you've said, that have been pushed to scale have failed. And so they said scale, what's happened so much is that they have scaled fast but learned slow. And I think that that's what we're experiencing a little bit, which is that if we're under pressure to scale so much, we don't have time to have that iterative cycle of do the program, then research it, then do it again, and then iterate on it and make it improve, just the cycle that you had been talking about it. And then we learn slow. And then how can we, as a community, learn together so that we're not all, doing these projects and not sharing all the knowledge that we learn. So I think where we're at right now is we feel that we're scaling faster than we can learn. And why do we consider it important to learn? Not just because we're academic, eggheads at all, but because learning will then lead to greater program improvement. And if we, when people say we don't have time to waste, we have to scale it now. Well, I feel we don't have time to waste. We have to learn now about what's working and what's not working. And so there is this real tension.
Yeah, and I think when I think about where intervention should go in the pipeline, right? So if I can design an intervention and it can kind of go anywhere, and someone wants impact and change right now, I drive them to early childhood because I'm like, okay, you got these little people, and you have a huge number of supports. Both social, emotional supports, different types of agencies, a growing sort of collective impact model around early childhood education. And that's one of it's sort of a high leverage place to be able to get kids school ready and then get them into schools. Now, what they face when they get into schools is maybe another funder's problem, but that there are certain areas that are sort of high leverage funding places that you could potentially get at scale. Right away, where we know a lot about what to do in that area. So it's always a difficult question, and perhaps the learning curve should look, instead of like this, it should look a little bit more staggered, and then there should be an expectation as to, once you've gone through, let's say, 3 learning failure cycles, that's when you should start to see exponential growth, right? That we should get really good at this, and that's when you can go from your boutique to your McDonald's at that point. But not to expect it, not to build an empire on a kernel of good data, right? Like, we've got this one thing and we think it works in this one place. You can't just build a whole infrastructure around that one kernel of data. Can I point to a partnership that went to scale very quickly, successfully? Because when we were originally funded by Infosys in 2009, 2010, and I think built largely upon our partnership with the Department of Youth and Community Development. And what we saw with that partnership was probably, we're a scientific organization. We work with universities, companies, all sorts of different partnerships. And what we saw with DYCD was a tremendously well-networked group of community-based organizations where there was the ability to, it's a funding agency, so have the funding from the top, a set of program managers who had deep relationships, regular relationships with all of these community-based organizations. 500 and something, Candace? How many are there? How many middle school? A lot. So we're talking about hundreds of community-based organizations in a huge city of 8 million people who are just this incredibly responsive network. And what we found, and the reason why I think this partnership, not only are they networked together, but at the core, the success of what every single adult in the room is doing with these kids is they want those kids to leave there happier and healthier than when they walked in. And so if that means the kids need to have a snack first, they need to spend some time talking about something that happened at school, that happens first, and then science happens, computer science happens after those kids are ready to learn. And we went to 110 sites in our first year. We actually over-expanded a little bit for the number of scientists we had. And so what I've been looking for in every place that we look to scale the program is, do you have an infrastructure like DYCD? Now, it can be a city agency, it can be one of the new ecosystems, it could be a network of funders, whatever it is. But if you want to reach scale and you have found this responsive type of infrastructure that's serving the types of kids you want to serve, serving them really well, and has this sort of push-pull within it, then I think you can take a really high-quality program and just ramp it up. And then you have to find those limiting factors. For us, the limiting factors are the number of scientists. But
well, so I know we're running short on time here. I'm just struck by the fact that when we're talking about, understanding impact and maximizing the efficacy of funding, so much of this seems to hinge on the expectations that the grantee and the grantor go into it together with. It's just that, you guys have all spoken very eloquently about the need to balance these and to not discount, not to toss impact for the sake of scale, or, and not to completely devalue tossing scale for the sake of I think use the word boutique, like really local impact. And I think I know we've got about maybe 30 seconds left, so this might be a good place to leave it. But I want to thank you all for being part of this, and this was awesome. This is a real honor for me to be up here with the three of you.
Can they
Do
question?
we have time for some questions here?
Yeah. Oh, as many as, yeah.
Do it.
Thank you for everything you guys were hitting on. One of the things that I just thought came up on the conversation on scale was that if we're all in this together, there's an ability to achieve scale from an aggregate point of view. And you just hit on it in New York City, right? If you can begin to network a whole series of organizations and people who care, who are making a difference, and find that common ground, all of a sudden now you created scale. Maybe one organization didn't do that by themselves, but in the aggregate you did. So if you move that from New York City to the state of New York, to the Northeast, to the U.S., that's kind of been our approach from an ideology point of view, is that we're just trying to connect dots and look at things like what Jane's talking about, making sure we got some consistency. So my question is, have you found yourselves over time in that situation where the best of what we're talking about has happened because of collaboration, partnership, and kind of that aggregate networking?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good collective impact models now, and NSF just closed up a big solicitation called Includes, which I'm sorry, I can't remember what all the letters stand for, but does look at is a collective impact model. And I think just to go back to the funders, what funders need to recognize, and I think organizations that want to be part of a collective impact model, is like, you're doing what you're doing, but then somebody needs to fund the activities of, it's that backbone organization, the activities of the collective impact model. I think Strive in Cincinnati does this really well. I think 100 Can 10 does this really well. And I think some of the STEM ecosystems are starting to do it really well. But you actually do have to have budget lines for convening, for communication, for common metrics, for all of those different things.
What were you going to say?
I was just going to add that in Oakland, we're thinking about doing something very similar, which is we've all gotten to the place where there's a lot of activity happening, and now we just need to connect up because we can't all serve the entire pipeline from K all the way through workforce. So we're now syncing up, and stay tuned.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really key thing. It's community, and it's working together with other organizations. And I mean, when I immediately go back to the civil rights movement. I mean, real social change. Social change only really happens in a movement. And so, but we have to learn while we're going along. It's just,
It's hard.
We're
It's hard
at
to
a
mind together.
Yeah, we're at an super exciting time for this work. I mean, when do you have the President of the United States getting up and calling for computer science for all and making it an equity issue? I mean, it's super exciting, and yet we have to go deeper. We just have to go deeper, and to go deeper into the classrooms and into the learning, you just need time and
money.
And money. Yeah, time and money. Yeah. Yeah. We've just repeated ourselves over and over again about this, but does anyone else have a question?
Well,
I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we're getting out of the hook is coming, but hopefully, if you guys have questions, some of us can hang out a little bit and have some informal conversations after this as well. So, thank you to the panel. Oh, so we got social not working. So thank you to this wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.